Hello, and welcome back to Dave's American Flyer Trains for the continuation of the rebuild of 322, the 464 Hudson locomotive with smoke and tinder from A.C. Gilbert and American Flyer Lines. This is a Type 2, and it was built in approximately 1947. As you saw in the first segment to this video, I've completed the initial chassis assembly, including the side rods. No other linkages because I'm going to need the body of the locomotive to be in position to do that. But I decided to go ahead and reassemble everything else, and I thought it was going to be just as simple as picking up the reverse unit in the field, dropping them down, which is pretty easy to do. These screws hold the reverse unit on. There was a couple of contact points, solder points that needed to be reestablished, and then of course it was just lining the field up with the pins and then pushing on the brush bracket assembly. But that's when I started getting some surprises. But a little bit of foundational information before we go any further about this reassembly. I maintain in my parts these thrust or space washers that I purchased from Portlines, and they are in various thicknesses. I don't really need this many, but I do need them in several thicknesses. And they're used, as you know, at the base of the armature where it connects or goes into its own bushing, and or at the top of the armature where it goes in the upper bushing, which is part of the brush bracket assembly. What I found when I disassembled this for this second rebuild, because remember I'd already rebuilt it once before, is I found two of the spacer washers, the thicker variety, right down here between the bushing and the base of the armature. So I didn't know if I'd made a mistake or had done some detailed photography and put them back where they belong. So I consulted the factory service manual. The factory service manual shows two, one here at the base and one at the top. So I decided to see where that would get me. I put one at the base and one at the top. So I proceeded with the assembly with one here and one here. But I noticed that when I put one on the end, the commutator end of the armature, was that it looked like it was dangerously close and could possibly short out and cause a bar-to-bar short. These being the bars of the commutator, there's three of them. It could cause a short. I mean, after all, it's a brass washer, and I said that I'm just not willing to risk that, so I removed it. Now I noticed that I got the spacing that was probably desirable between the commutator and the brush brackets or bushings, because you definitely don't want those rubbing. And there was space that between the top of the commutator and its own bushing that holds the top of the armature. But I was still a little nervous about it thrusting back, so I went ahead and did the reassembly. When I operated it, I didn't get anything shorting out or colliding, but I got a lot of, I don't know any better way to describe it than just a lot of rattle inside or around the armature. It seemed like that something was bumping when it was operating, and I didn't know if I had put the wheel on correctly, I had not quartered it correctly, and one of the side rods or both were binding, or exactly what was going on, but I knew that it shouldn't do that. It was just making a horrific bumping sound. So that's when I decided to put the other washer here, put the two back at the base of the armature in its own bushing. But that put the commutator, I thought, dangerously close to these brackets that hold the brushes, very close, that they could maybe even arc. And it started pinching the top of the armature against the bushing that was in this particular brush bracket assembly. And somebody had already mentioned in a previous video, watch out for that pinching to occur. So there I had a dilemma of I probably needed the two thrust washers here, and sure enough I did, but how was I going to prevent the commutator from coming in contact with anything, and then the top of the shaft from touching or bumping to not preventing it from bumping in and thus allowing the brush brackets to touch the commutator. I was looking for something I could put here. So I thought about one of these washers. I dropped it in and said, well, that's probably not going to work. I'm putting in something brass that could probably cause a bar-to-bar short on this armature. I mean, after all, it's brass. These are brass, and if I cleaned them off, it's probably metal exposed. And that's when I looked in Hannon's book. Hannon's book shows this as being the first steamer armature, the one that's in here. You could tell by the insulation type that was at the base of it. He also shows this one with a thicker insulator beneath the commutator, or the commutator's support mechanism or structure. And then he showed one which he called purple wire. And I was thinking about substituting one of these, thinking it might fit better in this particular structure. But then I began examining these really, really closely, and I thought I saw something right here on one of them, I don't remember which one it was, that looked like a washer. And I kept picking at it, and then I got out an X-Acto knife, and sure enough, I was able to pull it off. And it looked like a washer. I cleaned it thoroughly with soap and water and with alcohol, and it turns out it looked like it was plastic or nylon. And I said, well, maybe somebody has thought of this before to prevent the bar-to-bar or the bar-to-shaft shorting, putting that washer in there. So here's what I ended up doing. 2 spacers here seem to be necessary to prevent that thumping or bumping that the armature was performing. I put the nylon spacer at the top of the armature. It provided the spacing that I felt comfortable with, that the top of the armature shaft would not touch the bushing up here, nor would the commutator come in contact with the brush bracket. However, it could be a little bit tight. So I ended up putting 2 lock washers, one on either side here and at the other screw, creating this little tiny gap right here, which apparently made all this work. To the person's point, I'm not convinced that these are the exact same size and distance that are the same as this one in this particular train, and it may not be substitutable without these modifications. So I thought that solved the dilemma. I'm still a little bit nervous about, over time, this particular arrangement here. Maybe I need to put the same type of washers down here on the pins that would make a flat plane then more possible, where the brush bracket assembly attaches onto the field. But now let's go on to the next set of surprises. I don't know if it was from rough handling or just handling it too aggressively or just normal wear and tear, but I noticed that when I put the assembly back together, that these wires came off, and they are the ones that connect to one side of the coil. The coil comes up through this little insulating bar right here on the top of the reverse unit, and provides the contact point for wires to be soldered that connect to the coil. And that grommet had broken. Now, I've had a history of that happening. I've got 2 perfectly not salvageable but serviceable reverse units, top reverse units, boiler reverse units, that the exact same thing has happened, and that is that grommet has come out right there. I don't know if it was too much heat from solder or what, but they both have come out. And therefore I said, I've got to do something to get the wire out of that coil onto another connecting point. And I came up with the idea of, why not use the 3rd hole, the center hole, and see if I couldn't bring it up through that. So I reached up under here, grabbed this wire that goes on this side from the coil, pulled it a little bit to rip it apart just a tad from the insulating tape, and then inserted it up through that insulation. There you see it right there. I'm wiggling it with my finger. I said, well, maybe that's enough of a proof of concept that it'll work. So I did the exact same thing on this one. I cleaned the wire with sandpaper, just scraping it across to get that cover off of it, that coating, as well as with a X-Acto knife, and then I tested it with a bolt-on meter, and it seemed to be making connections. So I pulled the wire up identical to this. But I knew that probably was not going to be structurally good enough to be soldered against 2 wires. I put this blue tape on just to provide a little bit of cautious insulation. but I still needed something to attach it to. And I said, boy, wouldn't it be perfect if I could find one of those little grommets. So I went rooting around in my supplies and noticed that it appears that the same grommet is used by A.C. Gilbert to attach a finger to a fingerboard. And there it is. So I broke one of these non-serviceable fingerboards I had in my supply, non-serviceable because it's got a hole in the finger, so I knew I wasn't going to use it, broke it apart, and I was able to crack all this off of it, leaving just that little grommet. I dropped the grommet onto the board with the wire protruding through it, pressed it down in there, and sure enough, it latched in to this little insulating board. I then proceeded to do the soldering on top, and the results are shown there. And it seems to have worked. So that was a surprise, and it gave me confidence that in the future, maybe I could bring these reverse units back into service at some point. You notice this one has been in service before because it's got the newer style replaced reproduction fingerboards. It's wired. It's also got a nice drum on the inside. I'm not even sure why I pulled it out to begin with, but it too is probably also serviceable. So that's being said, I got that done. I got some rewiring done up here, put in some newer wires. The only ones I didn't replace were these longer wires which come from the field all the way up here. I did not do those, but I did all these shorter ones, including this one, to get some more flexible wire in there, reattached it to the bulb socket and to the bulb base, and everything worked as you saw in the previous video. It has good response, and most of the noise that it made is due to the fact it's sitting up on a wood structure on my test table.